Creation Science, our second week. We've got 8 more weeks after tonight, so we got a nice long time to spend together. Last week we looked at the idea of design inference, the idea that the teleological argument, the argument from design that God exists and how design is evident everywhere. We're going to see a little more on that subject tonight, but we're going to look at it from the idea that complexity of life, how does it become possible that Darwinian evolution can explain all that. So we're going to have to look into Darwinian evolution tonight a little bit to see what they claim. But before we go any further, let me pray and we'll get started here. Father in heaven, we just ask you to be with us tonight, be with our church tonight, all that goes on in the next hour. Father, we just thank you for the many blessings that you've bestowed upon us. Father, we ask you to help us to be ready to give a reason, a defense for the reason of the hope that's in us to everyone that asks, Father, that we do it in meekness and fear. You tell us not to quarrel, but to be gentle and to teach with patience, Father, that in humility we might be able to correct those who are in any opposition, Father. So we just ask that the things we learn tonight, that you might impart grace to us, that we might be able to impart that to others. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, there's enough evidence in the world for people to know that there's a God, don't you think? Romans 1:20 tells us that for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by what? The things that are made. That's creation right there. Even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. So none of us have an excuse to say that there is no God, because it's right around us. Of course, this week, as I said, we're going to look at the grand scope of evolution. Not just biological evolution. Well, I should say evolution is not just what we think of as biological evolution. There is a much larger scope of evolution. And the first thing is stellar evolution. It attempts to explain how the stars and planets got here. And we'll look a little bit of that in another week or so, or another few weeks or so. But stellar evolution says that it all started with nothing, right? The singularity and the Big Bang happened. And that matter is mostly hydrogen out of that Big Bang, that you just have the simple hydrogen atoms, and they all coalesced into stars as they started to cool. And there were no planets to begin with, just stars. And the stars exploded at the end of their lifespan, the billions of years that a star might last. And the heavy elements were created during that first explosions of these stars, the first supernovas that happened. The heavy elements like carbon and gold and all those sorts of elements happened during that first explosion. So you have a new generation, and those heavy elements then started coalescing because it's an explosion, and the gaseous cloud that resulted from that explosion started coalescing into planets. And so those heavy elements are how we ended up with our Earth and planets and so forth that we see here. And then there's a second generation of stars being born out of all that, and some of the planets that are formed out of that actually have seas of water in them, so they're able to theoretically support life. That's why they're so interested in water, finding water on Mars, is so that they can claim that Mars might have been able to support life at one point. And you get into this idea of chemical evolution next, because they say, as I said last week, that the rocks were there and the rain fell on those rocks over millions of years and formed the primordial soup. And lightning struck that soup and formed some amino acids, and those amino acids started chaining up together into ribonucleic acid and so forth, and or actually proteins, I should say. And single cells come out of that. They're alive and able to reproduce themselves. And so this is something that is said in the textbooks without much more explanation than that. And yet we're supposed to believe all this happened like this. And then we get into the biological evolution, because once you get life started, you got to get that single cell, because there's not a single cell on this earth that didn't come from a pre-existing cell already, except for that first one that God created, see. And because cell happens by a new cell comes about by cell division. One cell splits into two, and now you've got two cells, and that's how all life progresses. But you have the evolution in the seas. You have the single cell in that sea right there, and it splits and multiplies and begins to reproduce, and the fish come out of that. That's a big leap, isn't it? The amphibians come out of the fish, they crawl up on the land, and then you begin to have reptiles, and mammals come from the reptiles, and then you have you and me. And that's a pretty long story condensed into a very short term, from the goo through the zoo to you. And that's how it all happened. I forgot to do this here. Now, Charles Darwin, in 1859, published a book called The Origin of Species. Obviously a famous book because it really started the whole modern idea of evolution, as opposed to what typically had been believed was special creation. And Darwin's attempt was to explain all the variety that he saw in life by some sort of natural means. Remember, he went on that little ship called the HMS Beagle, and he went around to the Galapagos Islands, and he saw all the different species of life there, and he tried to explain this with a theory. His observation was that these organisms change over time due to adaptation. On one island, he saw certain types of species, and he didn't see that species on another island, and he figured that they've adapted to whatever environment they were in. These different islands had different environments that they were in, and so that the organisms would adapt. The theory was that given enough time, unlimited change can span all of the major types. And of course that goes directly against the Bible, because God said each kind would produce after its own kind, right? But he called it descent with modification. Now that was the term he used in his book. The idea of descent is just a descendant. I'm a descendant of my parents and my grandparents and so forth. And so as the species descends from parent to child, there are modifications that occur between the parent and child. The child's slightly different than the parent. If you have more than one child, or even one child, you realize that child's not like me at all. Or these children are so different, and you think that one may be tall, one may be short, one may be smart, one may be mediocre or whatever. I mean, you just have all the different, one may be happy, one may be real thoughtful, it's just all these different types. Well, these changes that Darwin noticed gave him an idea that this modification could be the mechanism by which evolution occurs, by which all these things happen. They're always occurring, and so he came up with this idea of natural selection. He thought, what would it be that would cause one change to be preferred over another? And sometimes it's called the survival of the fittest. Modifications that are beneficial tend to have a better chance of surviving to the age of reproductivity, and thus passing its benefit along to the offspring. And so this is the concept that Darwin came up with, but he actually knew nothing about DNA or genes or chromosomes or cell division or any of that. He just looked at the cell or looked at life and thought it was just common sense that things change, from parent to child. He thought those modifications were just part of it. And today, because they've now introduced the concept of DNA and the genes and so forth into it, they call it neo-Darwinism as opposed to just simply Darwinism. So neo-Darwinism is the concept that scientists really speak of when they talk about Darwinian evolution today. And they don't call them modifications anymore, they call them mutations. All of the change occurs by some sort of mutation. So there's this idea of a beneficial mutation. Now that's almost an oxymoron, right? You don't think of beneficial and mutation in the same sentence like that. But the core of an evolutionary process describes something that is purposeless, unintelligent, material cause. And I didn't mean to go that far, but I did. That was the idea that God is not involved in this process. Now, for the theological evolutionists, remember we talked about those different classifications of people that have different worldviews. The theological evolutionist believes there is a God, but he believes that evolution is the way he did it. But for him, God is unemployed. There's really nothing God needs to do because he just simply designed all the laws, put all the matter out there, flicked the switch, and everything started rolling downhill from there. God is not needed in this process. So a purposeless, unintelligent, material cause is what evolution describes. So what's the evidence for evolution? What is it that makes them think that evolution occurred? Well, one of the things is this idea of homology. And homology simply means the study of sameness. A homo means same, ology means study of, and so they're looking at biological similarity between the different species across the different major types of animals. And they say that the result of this, the similarity is the result of some sort of common ancestor. The giraffe, for example, by the way, has a long neck, and that helps the giraffe to survive and be able to pick fruit from the tall trees. And so this long neck is beneficial to the giraffe. So the giraffes would tend to keep those long necks according to the natural selection idea. By the way, let me ask you a question. How does a banana survive based upon natural selection? What is its benefit of being tasty and good to eat and all that? Well, I mean, the bananas get eaten. That's not the idea of natural selection. I mean, why would you want to protect yourself from being eaten if you want to be a good banana and you know, have the seeds fall to the ground and make more banana trees and so forth. So dare we say its purpose is to be eaten, like we discovered last week. Same thing with a rose. What's the benefit of being beautiful and smelling good? The rose is there for us to enjoy the beauty of those things. And I can say that about so many of the creation that God has made that we are so awed at. A second evidence of evolution that they claim is this. Before I go there, I didn't explain what you're seeing on the screen here. That's a skeleton of a horse right there. Horse's head and legs on the kind of the left-hand side there, and right next to it, this little rib cage right here is from a man. I can't see, there's the man's skull right there. And so you see the similarity in the rib cages and the spine, and they both have a pelvis, and they both have a cervical spine, and they both have a cranium and a jaw. They both have the forearm legs and the hands and so forth. I mean, but would you say man and horse are similar? No, not at all. But if you squint your eyes and look at it, you can say, oh yeah, they're kind of similar like that. Well, looking a little bit deeper, you can look at the X-ray of a crocodile's front leg, and you'll notice that this part of his arm, there's two bones right there. And same thing with my arm. There's two bones here, the radius and the ulna. And what do those two bones allow me to do? Well, it allows me to rotate my hand like this, and that's a very advantageous thing to have. Pretty good design, I would say. Well, it's interesting that a bird also has those same two bones in its arm. And so you see this homology, or this similarity between completely different species, all the way down to the hand bones and to the digits of the fingers and that single bone up here. This is evidence for them that evolution must be at work here, because it all came from a common ancestor like that. A second evidence, as I was saying before, of evolution is this idea of adaptation. What is it that allows animals to change a given species, like these finches up on the top left right here? Why would one finch have a long curved beak and another finch have a short stout beak like this? Well, the beaks, or the things that these finches are the things that Darwin studied on the Galapagos Islands, and he determined that these finches with the long curved beaks would allow them to be better able to grab the insects that were embedded down in these rocky crags, so they could reach their beak down in there and get the insects and help them feed a little bit. On a different island, these types of finches predominated with the stout beaks like this, and they didn't have the rocky crags like that, but they had a lot of predators there, and then those stout beaks helped those finches defend themselves and fight like that. And so he surmised that this adaptation was because of where they lived. Look at this thing right here. This is an owl right here on the left, and a moth right here. It's called the Polyphemus moth. And this moth uses this idea of mimicry to make itself look like the owl. Now, by the way, I mean, what this does is if a predator is coming along and that moth is sitting on a tree and all of a sudden senses that predator is close, he's going to flap his wings out. That squirrel or bird or whatever it is that sees those two eyes looking back at him, sees his nemesis, the owl, right here, and gets away. Okay, so it's a defense mechanism. Now, do you think this moth knows that he looks like an owl? No, not at all. And so he didn't do this by his own design. They say that it just happened over millions of permutations, and it came to be this. My question would be, what happened to all those other millions that were there before that? Why did they not? Why did they make it to this point? These two rabbits down here. You've got a white rabbit, a black rabbit. You've got rabbits with long hair. You've got rabbits with short hair, small, large rabbits, and so forth. Why are the differences in rabbits like that? Well, a small rabbit, that might help that rabbit to hide itself into a rock or something like that, from running away from the predators. A darker rabbit might do better in a forest. A white rabbit would do better in the snow, and so it depends upon where they typically live. A long-haired rabbit would do better in cold weather. And so these adaptations allow the rabbits to preserve themselves, in essence. There's this story of the peppered moth. This is the bark on the tree, and you've got two moths on here, one with a light-colored look to it, another one with a dark-colored look, and you see the dark-colored one blends itself into the tree much better. This white one just stands out very brightly. Well, the story is told, and at this point there's even question as to whether the story is even true or not, but it's still told, so I'll tell it to you. Over in England, there were these trees with this light-colored bark, kind of like a birch tree or whatever. And these moths, some were light, some were dark, and some were speckled, kind of both. And so you have these moths, these peppered moths, and the light moths were the ones that were predominant. Most of the moths that you saw were white, the demographics, so to speak. But then all of a sudden the Industrial Revolution comes along, and all the soot from the smokestacks and so forth darkened the bark on the trees, and guess what happened? The light-colored moths started to lessen in population, and the dark-colored moths became the predominant moths at that point. And this is used as evidence for natural selection, proof of evolution. Natural selection, though, actually preserved the species. It didn't get rid of anything, it just kept the species alive during that period of soot and so forth. Now, by the way, they don't tell the rest of the story. The rest of the story is they eventually cleaned up all those smokestacks and so forth, and the bark on the trees went back to a lighter color, and guess what happened? The light-colored moths started to predominate again. Now, I should say this, no new species were created. It's still a peppered moth. You still have the same black ones, the white ones, and the peppered ones, or the spotted ones that were there before. And no moth changed colors. It just simply shifted in its population right there. So if the question is, if evolution is change over time, I've got no problem with that. That's a good word. It describes exactly what that means. And change over time is exactly what we observe in certain species. That's non-controversial. But evolution has come to mean something much different than that. Because natural selection can indeed preserve favorable traits, just like we saw in that peppered moth right here. But it's not new information. There's nothing new being created from that. It's not a creative process. Those notes are probably old. I'm sorry if you're trying to find some of this stuff. It may or may not be up there, but most of it should be in there somewhere. But what about breeding animals? That's something that breeders do. They try to improve the species of horse, or try to get different variations of dogs and so forth, or whatever. They do the same thing with plants, corn. They always read about these hybrid corns, with the sweet yellow corn, big ear, big plump, juicy corn. You've got the old Indian corn that wasn't so good, but they do this by breeding. But the problem is these animals hit certain limits. You can only breed dogs and get a dog just so big. You've never seen a dog as big as a horse. It won't happen. You have seen one about half as big as a horse, the Great Dane or whatever those animals are. And you've seen little tiny dogs too, but they can only get so small. They won't go much smaller than that. So there's this idea of limitation, not an idea, this is evidence of limitation. And you can only get an ear of corn to be so big. So all of this hits these limits. The mule, that came about because they tried to breed the best traits of a horse with the best traits of a donkey, and they came up with the mule because the horse and the donkey could mate together. But the problem is, what happened to the mule? He couldn't mate. So every mule had to be a horse and a donkey as the parents. And so why couldn't the mule mate? Well, because he had something wrong with his genes. This breeding and selection and so forth causes loss of information, causes corruption of the gene pool out there. And so selective breeding really equals intelligent breeding. It's somebody acting from the outside. So this is not really natural selection. This is somebody from the outside working the information that's already in the gene pool right here. So they use already existing genes. And you get this loss of information as you work your way. You take any two mutts, for example. Take two medium brown dogs, and from those two dogs, in one man's lifetime, you can come up with an incredible variety of different dogs because you've got a lot of variety in these medium brown dogs' genes right there. And you start breeding them, and you can get dogs as little as poodles or dogs as large as huskies or whatever from these two mutts here. And but you end up with a shallow end of the gene pool. The two poodles could breed, you could breed and breed and breed, you never would get a husky out of it because you've lost information through that selective breeding process right there. But this is the classic bait and switch. They get you nodding and saying, yeah, I can see how this change over time works. Yeah, I've seen that before. I've seen the corn, I've seen the breeding, I can see the homology, I can see the similarities, I can see the adaptation. And we all agree with everything we've just seen right here. But then they once they get you nodding like that and used to saying, yeah, I can see that, they say that small change becomes all change, okay? They start saying that they pull out just the simple things that we've looked at before and they slip in, you know, from an ape to a man, okay? Or they slip in from, you know, a reptile to a bird. But they don't explain that process. They explain the previous process, the small stuff, but then they didn't explain the big steps that they took to get there. That's microevolution as opposed to macroevolution. A horizontal change within the species, within the kind that God deemed and allowed in His Word, versus a vertical change across the kinds, from one kind to another. This is called the molecules to man theory. Some call it the pond scum to man theory. You get this evolutionary tree. You start at the bottom of this tree, the root of the tree, and you have nothing but non-living chemicals. And then you start to get these algae, you know, after the lightning struck that primordial soup. And then you start getting plants, they evolve into plants, and then you get the chordates, which, you know, takes you off down the kind of the fish realm right here for a while. Down one branch of this tree, you've got the worms and the arthropods and the insects go down that branch, and down this other branch, amphibians and reptiles. As you go up and then finally birds and mammals, finally primates, and then us, you and me. We're at the top of that tree right here. We're the most sophisticated. We like that position up there. But isn't it kind of disturbing to know that you and the ant had some sort of common ancestor down here? That both of yours great-great-great-great-granddaddy was a rock down here. So that's, well, that bothers me a little bit. Stephen Jay Gould was a biologist, a brilliant man. He believed all this. He said the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the raw fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. He was a paleontologist as well. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches, and the rest is inference. What does that word inference mean? Guess, right, guess, yeah. The rest is a guess. However reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. We fancy ourselves as the only true students of life's history. Yet to preserve our favorite account of evolution by natural selection, we view our data as being so bad that we never see the very process we profess to study. They look at that evolutionary tree and they can take all the animals they see and they can put them on the tips of all those branches of the tree, but they can't put anything that connects them. They can't put anything at the nodes, at the joints right there, where one branch comes off at the other. And so they really don't have any data with these transitional forms right here. And there it is with an honest statement right there from Stephen Jay Gould. But if natural selection doesn't create anything new and it does not change anything, then where does all the change come from? It used to say that, the giraffe striving to reach up to get that fruit at the top of the tree caused his neck to get a little longer, and he stretched his neck as he kept doing it, and so forth. And made his children have long necks, you know, and then they did the same thing, trying to get that even further up fruit. And so this striving in a direction was their explanation for all this change. And of course, we know now that that's not true. They also called it use and disuse, the vestigial organ theory. You know, you've got an appendix and they don't know what it's good for, and they figure, well, it's just the byproduct of some past evolutionary process that went on, and we don't know what it's for today. And we're going to study about DNA next week, but the genes that are specified by the DNA, the code that we saw last week in that DNA, are the things that tell how proteins are to be made. And your protein is what makes up your muscles, your hair tissue, skin, heart, all those things have to have different kinds of proteins in different parts of the cells and so forth that make it up. And so these mutations are the secret to all of this change. This DNA, you know, it's got a transcription process. When you copy one cell to another, it's possible that the DNA could have gotten copied wrong, which means the gene is wrong, which means the protein's wrong, which means you may have an extra finger, or you may have an extra, you know, tougher skin, or faster, you know, tighter muscles where you can run faster, or whatever it is. The mutations can be one of either harmful, lethal, or neutral at best. And this is normally the way we think of a mutation, as being something bad right here. But then they say that some mutations could actually be beneficial. And so these beneficial mutations are the ones that actually are preserved, and all these other ones that are harmful or lethal are just weeded out because of natural selection. They don't benefit the critter, and so they don't pass those traits on, the harmful or lethal ones. The beneficial ones would be very rare. I mean, I've never seen a beneficial mutation, but they say that they must happen, so I'm guessing that they've at least seen one of them. But if they've only seen one, it's pretty rare indeed. And so you get this change through the copying process and beneficial mutations. A mutation, by the way, is an error in the copy process, as I explained before. It's, for example, I told you I was a computer programmer, and so if I've been working on a computer program for a couple of years and I'm ready to release it and publish it out there, I'll put it on a CD and I'll say, okay, install this on your computer. What if in the process of my copying it from my computer onto that CD that it got corrupted some kind of way? Some of the bits got changed up and so forth. What do you think the chances are that program could have gotten better? No way. It's not going to even work. It's going to have a bug in it. And so the copy process, when there's an error in there, things don't get better, they get worse. And DNA is an interesting thing. The amoeba, which is a single-celled animal, has about 2 million of the nucleotide pairs, we'll look more at that next week, in its DNA. So it's 2 million things long, whatever that means. And the human has about 6 billion pairs. Now the difference between those two is going to be 3,000 times more complex. The human DNA sequence is 3,000 times more complex than the amoeba sequence, and that helped us out a little bit. We're glad of that. I'd like to be known to be more complex than amoeba. But the instructions to create a machine are directly proportional to the complexity of the machine, right? I mean, if I were to build a paper airplane, okay, thanks. If I were to build a paper airplane, I could write those instructions for how to make that, how to fold it up and fly it and so forth on the back of a 4x5 index card, right? I mean, it wouldn't take many instructions to do that, just a paragraph or two. But what if I wanted to build a space shuttle? We could fill this room up with the manuals and books and specifications to build that space shuttle. So it's the same thing with the DNA. Now, you got to have new information. If I'm going to evolve from a paper airplane to a space shuttle, I've got to produce that much new information. If I'm going to evolve from an amoeba to a human, I've got to produce 3,000 times as much information in the DNA as what's there to begin with. And so here is, I can't pronounce his name, Theodosius Dobzhansky or whatever. But anyway, American Scientist Journal writes, the process of mutation is the only known source of the raw materials of genetic variability and hence of evolution. The mutants which arise are, with rare exceptions, deleterious, that means bad, to their carriers, at least in the environments in which the species normally occurs. And so mutation is the only known source. And here, this is confirmed by Ernst Mayr in the book Evolutionary Changes to the Mathematical Interpretation of Evolution. He says, ultimately, all variation is, of course, due to mutation. We'll talk about a little bit more again next week about how that mutation occurs with the DNA. It's usually radiation of some sort, cosmic rays or whatever, cause problems with the copying process. But we've got to build all this new information through mutation, so we've got to have enough beneficial ones, which are, like I said, pretty rare, in order to be able to produce several orders of magnitude additional information like that. There are a number of different systems that you've got to be able to produce. To go from an amoeba to a human being, you got to be, or to any kind of mammal or whatever, you've got to develop the eyes, the nose, the smell, the ability to smell, the ability to hear. You've got to develop the respiratory system where you bring in oxygen and mix it with the blood and so forth, the cardiovascular system where you deliver that oxygen and nutrients and so forth to the rest of the body and remove waste products. With the liver and the kidney. You've got to build reproductive systems, the sexual organs. I mean, think about that one for a while. How does a single-celled animal end up with two sexes? You know, you could worry about that one for a long time, and you're not going to get there. The nervous system, messaging. Your nerves are an incredible system that go from your brain down to every part of your body that communicates and regulates the whole thing. All these systems. Now, Charles Darwin, in his book, The Origin of Species, said that if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. All right, thank you, Charles Darwin. Appreciate that, because that's what we're going to do next. Michael Behe wrote a book called the Black Box. Is that, no, was that the name of it? Darwin's Black Box. That's it. Thank you. I'm sorry. I had a mental lapse there. But anyway, he talked about the way he described irreducible complexity is with this mousetrap. And of course, the mousetrap has 5 major parts. You've got the catch there where you put the cheese on there, and you've got the spring, and you've got the hammer. Of course, you got to have the wooden base for all this to mount to, and then you've got to have the holding bar to go over and hold the spring back and put the energy into it. So you got the 5 major parts in this mousetrap. Now, let me ask you a question. If we take away one of those parts, how many mice do you think we'd be able to catch? 0. It's not 80% if we take 1 out of 5 away. It's 0% because it's now by definition broken. It doesn't work anymore. So any precursor to an irreducibly complex system is by definition non-functional. A missing part is by definition non-functional. And so all these parts, you got to think about it. That mousetrap was going to evolve in some sort of biological thing, and of course you've got all kind of mousetraps, the Venus flytrap, you know, you got all kind of mousetraps actually in life. All the parts have to be beneficial by themselves in order to be able to survive, because the critter is not smart. It doesn't know that it's creating a wing so that it can fly one day. I mean, these are just changes that, so each small, tiny little change that's going to stick around, get passed on to its descendants, has got to be beneficial. And so along the way, of course, it takes millions of years. All these tiny little changes that are supposed to occur, each one has to be beneficial to the survival. Yet it's not part of a complete system yet, and so it must play some other beneficial function than catching mice, for example. The hammer's got to be useful for something else. The spring's got to be useful for something else until they all get put together to make a mousetrap. Now, by the way, an airplane is an amazing thing that we can fly and so forth. I mean, what, 100 years ago we'd never dreamed of that. But when you strip an airplane down to its bare essentials, it's entirely made up of non-flying parts. Each one of those parts is worthless for flying an airplane. They may be good for something else for a while, but you got to put them all together in such an organized, complex way in order for it to actually be a working airplane. Okay, Darwin thought a lot about the eye. I had a quote in here, and I don't have time to read it right now, so I won't, but that eye gave him all kinds of fits with his theory. He kept thinking, how could the eye have come together? But Darwin talked about this worm. He had the idea of a worm that had some sort of light-sensitive spot on this worm. And some of you won't be able to see this because you can't see around the screen here, but I'm going to draw a picture of the worm here. I'm not a good artist, and how do you make a worm other than doing something like that? But here's this little spot right here that's light sensitive. Okay, so the worm now has a light sensitive spot. Light comes down and it changes the way that little cells work and so forth in there, so it's light sensitive. It reacts to light and so forth. And his idea was, well, perhaps this light sensitive spot started to develop a little cavity right here. Okay? And then that cavity got deeper and deeper, and pretty soon got a place for a little eyeball to go in. Boom, an eyeball pops in there. And before you know, you got regular, vision like we have today. It's a long story made short, right? That's pretty much what he did, was a long story made short. But he was pretty proud of his theory, and so he was trying to make it work. But you think about this light-sensitive spot, that's an early retina, because a retina in your eye is what is able to sense the light coming in, the photons of light coming in. But what if, if there's no nerve attaching that little cell to the worm's brain, there's no benefit there, okay? Somebody's got to interpret what that light means, right, for it to be able to be beneficial like that. And so, even if it had an eyeball, an occipital cortex, that's still not enough. You've got to have a brain to process the image, and you've got to have the software in that brain that knows how to interpret, and because each little rod in your eye says, I just received a photon of light. Well, you got to put them all together and make a picture. And then you got to do it hundreds of times a second to make a moving picture like we see. Just incredible. So the brain that does all this is an incredible thing as well as far as the eye system is concerned. So if there's no beneficial to this little light-sensitive spot that this worm had, the changes are going to get lost. The benefits are going to be, the non-benefits are going to be selected out. So Darwin's theory only allows for mutations that increase the survivability of the organism. So you can see that complex systems are not built by some little small stepwise process along the way, that the mutations that aren't beneficial will be lost. And this is what's known as the non-viability of transitional forms. All right, now we're going to take a look at something a little more complex than a mousetrap. We're going to spend some time looking at the eye and this incredible design of the eye and its complexity. Now, this is the light-sensitive spot in your eye. It's actually a picture of a single rod. The rod is which is able to sense dark versus light. It doesn't sense color. The cones are what sense various types of color and so forth. The red, greens, and blues are the primary colors. But the rod is just a long cell like this. This is a picture of a single cell, and you've got the inner segment of the cell and the outer segment of the cell. This outer segment has a bunch of little discs in it that are sensitive to light, and this is just a blown up view of how each individual disc works and so forth. But the nerve is attached to this end of the cell right here, and this cell sends a signal up to the brain saying, hey, I just received a photon of light, passes it off to the brain, lets the brain figure out what to do with it from there. Let me show you the whole process. Now, I've put this slide together as a little movie sort of presentation. And when I explain this to you, you're going to see this incredible cascading chain reaction of events going on here. And I'm going to use some fancy big words right here. And I don't intend for you to really understand what's going on, because I don't. But I want you, basically it's just intended to wow you, just to go, whew. And it's going to go over every one of our heads right here as it does this. It goes over mine, even though I've tried to put this together. But this is what happens when a single photon of light comes down and strikes. Now this is the outside of that cell, one part of it, that little round half of a cylinder right here. This is the rod cell wall right here, and this is one of the discs, and there's a bunch of discs in there. But each one of these discs is capable of receiving a photon of light and reacting to that photon of light. And so in the dark, this rod produces all sorts of molecules called cyclic GMP. Now, I don't know what the GMP stands for, but that's what they say. There's a bunch of cyclic GMP molecules. And they regulate this little channel right here, this what's called a sodium ion channel. This is a hole through the side of the wall that allows sodium ions to pass in and out right here. And these cyclic GMP molecules inside this cell regulate that. They close it down or open it up. And so it allows these sodium ions to pass through like this. And so you see these sodium ions coming in, and they're coming inside the cell. And so you've got this these positive, see it's Na plus, that's the symbol for sodium plus. An ion is missing an electron. And so it's got a positive charge because it's got more protons than it does electrons, and so it's got a positive charge. So you've got as many positive charges on the inside as you do on the outside, so you get a balance of charge across that cell wall right there. Now, notice this little doodad right here. That's called an 11-cis retinal, the red thing there, the little curve right there is an 11-cis retinal, and it's sitting inside a rhodopsin molecule. And this 11-cis retinal molecule is sensitive to light. And so a photon of light comes down from the sky through the lens of your eye and hits that 11-cis retinal. And what the 11-cis retinal does then is to polymerize or to straighten out. It no longer has that curve shape. It flops out straight because it's been energized by that photon of light like that. So it's been changed. And this behavior affects this transducin molecule sitting right next to it, making it do something different. It normally has a bound GDP molecule attached to it. And then what happens is this transducin reacts to that change, and the GDP drops off, and a GTP jumps on. I don't know what these things are, but that's what they say happens. Kind of neat. Now, this is modified transducin molecule then binds to another molecule called phosphodiesterase sitting in here. That's the green thing over here. So it jumps on there, and what this then has the ability to do is to cut these cyclic GMP molecules. Remember what they did? They regulate this sodium ion. So this guy starts to cut these cyclic GMP, the cyclic off of it, so now all you have is the GMP. And what happens next is that the ion channel then closes down because of that. All the sodium ions can't pass through anymore, so they deplete on the inside of the cell. There's plenty of them on the outside of the cell. And this gives us an imbalance of charge between the inside and the outside. You've got an overabundance of sodium ions out here and an underabundance of them in here, so it's positive out here and negative down here. That's just like a battery. You see a positive and a negative on a battery. And so you've got a little battery going right here. Now there's a nerve attached to the end of this thing and allows that rod to send a signal through the synaptic joint right there to the nerve up to the brain. And the brain gets millions of these every second, okay, because it's coming from all the rods and a lot of them every second like this. And it interprets the whole process as vision. Now, if that weren't enough, the whole thing has to be put back like it was to begin with. So it's got to reverse the whole process, put it all back like it was so it can receive another photon of light. And all this happens in split seconds. I mean, it's just, and it's done. That's how your eye is working right now. Do you realize why your eyes get so tired? I mean, it's like, ooh, that's tired of reading or whatever. Just incredible. Now, some scientists have taken an interesting approach to discredit the design movement. Remember the intelligent design people? By criticizing the design of the eye. They say, this is really bad design. They say that over here is the way it should have been done, because when you get the arrow is the direction of the photon of light, these rods, each one of these things are rods right here. And they say that you'd like to have that light sensitive part of the rod right there on the front where it can receive that light real easily. But what the creator did, or evolution, and they say did, was they turned the rods around so the light sensitive part is stuck way back here in the back. And the light cells have to, and the bundles of nerves are attached on the front here. And so you get all these nerves that kind of block the light out here. And so you got the rods upside down and turned around, and say that's terrible design. You ought to, you know, have the nerve cells running out the back like this. Anybody could look at that and see that's the way it ought to be done. So this is bad design. Proof that there is no real design, or that it's just you know, natural processes, purposeless, unintelligent, meaningless processes that do this. Now, let me tell you the rest of this story. You know, the nerve blocks this light. I'm sorry, the light is capable of damaging biological machinery. I mean, when you get a sunburn, that's because the light has burned you and damaged you and so forth. And your car, if you leave it sitting out in the sunshine for years on end, what happens to the paint? I mean, it peels away and eventually, it fades away and eventually peels. Light is a very damaging product. You don't realize it when you go out there, but if you stay there long enough, you will. This little stuff on the outside right here is a picture of here, and it's called the retinal pigment epithelium. I don't know what that is, but it's a lot of blood engorged cells over here. It supplies blood to all these things. It also supplies nutrients like vitamin A and so forth through this massive blood flow. And remember the light sensitive disc are on this side? Well, they've got to be sitting right next to the same, because those are the things that are getting beat up all the time. And they've got to be constantly replaced and regenerated and so forth. And so it's a good thing to have these cells, these rods, turned around the other way so that they can be constantly refreshed. If they were pointing the other way, they'd pretty soon be damaged and couldn't keep up with it. The other thing the blood flow does, by the way, is act as a heat sink. If you stand out in the sun long enough, you'll notice your skin gets hot. Okay, well, the same thing's happening to these rods right here. And so the massive amount of blood flow coming through there tends to, you know, direct that heat away from those rods like that. And so very good design when you start looking more deeply into it. And finally, it's darkly pigmented. It's very dark. And the reason it's very dark is because stray light that doesn't hit a rod, you don't want it bouncing off the back and then hitting it, because it would think it's coming from the wrong direction and so forth. And so it's all black. And so that's the same reason why your camera lens has got a black outside circle, so it doesn't have, if you look inside there, it looks all black. Well, it doesn't want to reflect any light there. Another good design. Well, so if you turn this whole thing around and put it on this side like they want it right here, it wouldn't work at all. Why? Because it's opaque. It wouldn't let any light through. But a mesh of nerves does let light through, sufficiently enough to make us have pretty good vision and make birds have fantastic vision. Birds can see a lot better than we can. So that's the thing right there. 10 minutes. Image processing. Well, we talked about how the brain has to be there to interpret all that thing. When you look off in the distance or see a letter on a page, the letter A, you know, everything goes through all those nerves, and the brain is able to recognize the pattern. It's able to interpret those signals. The frontal lobes in your brain is where pattern recognition occurs. The color correction occurs, the exposure correction, focusing control, because it's got to focus the lens in and out and so forth. It's got to control that, stop down the eye so it doesn't let in too much light in a bright room, or open it up if it needs more. All that's controlled by the brain talking to the eye through these nerves like this. Even today's computers can't keep up with that kind of speed like that. I mean, they're just barely able to with all the processing power they have, to do this. And by the way, it's interesting, computers work the same way the eye does. Every one of those rods, since it's black and white, there's 3 different types of cones, one for red, one for blue, one for green. Well, it's the same thing a TV monitor has, red, blue, and green cells on that screen. And so, and your cameras have red, blue, and green sensors in the digital cameras right now. And so they're patterned after that. So the next time you meet an evolutionist, ask this question. Would you please explain how random mutations over a long period of time could produce the visual system when the mutations that are supposed to give rise to it do not increase the survivability of the organism? In other words, they're of no benefit yet. So how do you produce? Just give me a straight out process of how the eye is created, if you want to simplify that question. That ought to give them a fit for a while and keep them busy so that you can go do some more research. Transitions. How do you go from an amoeba to a fish, to amphibians, to reptiles, to birds? Well, you got to, I mean, just look at the reptiles to birds. You got to have new body types. You got to have lightweight bones for flight, because a bird has to be light enough to where its muscles and wings will carry them out. You got to develop wings from what used to be arms. Remember that crocodile leg? Well, I mean, you got to make a wing out of that thing. So what can you imagine would be the process for making wings out of that? You got to develop feathers from scales. What used to be scales on the skin, now it's got to turn into feathers in some sort of way. Now, none of this is trivial, and it's vast amounts of new information that's got to be produced in that DNA. And all this is supposed to be happening by some sort of buildup of small mutations. And keep in mind that each small change, after each small change, it's got to be beneficial. So it'll be selected. Now, the W.E. Swinton, in this book on biology, says the origin of birds is largely a matter of deduction. There is no fossil evidence of the stages through which the remarkable change from reptile to bird was achieved. I love it when they're honest like that. I mean, you can find these little snippets or quotes in there in their works. This is the famous Archaeopteryx. Okay, you see this bird right here. This is an artist rendering, and this is the supposedly the fossil imprint of this bird right there. It's interesting because, well, you may not be able to see it in this picture, but he's got very sharp razor-like teeth on here. And birds just don't have teeth like that, okay? And those are reptiles' teeth. And say, we found it. There's the missing link between the bird and the reptile, right there. And so they loved this. Now, let's picture how it could be to go from a reptile to a bird. You get these reptiles, okay, these two critters, and they start to mate together, and they start getting mutations. And they start getting elongated scales, okay, on their hands and so forth, and longer scales than their parents, okay. And the scales are supposed to be beneficial, but the scales then are passed on to their children, and their children get longer and longer scales, and pretty soon these scales are starting to get kind of fuzzy, and starting to look like feathers even, right? Because you got this going here, and they're getting wings. Wonderful thing. And this is millions of years over a period of time, but notice that the scales are starting to hang down longer than their feet because the feathers got to stick out further, right? Now, they can't yet fly because the wings aren't formed enough, but the feathers are starting to get in the way of their running too, right? So they can't run away from predators. And they can't go get that food that they need to get faster than their brothers and sisters. So what's natural selection going to do? Take them right out. They're not survivable. They're not fittest. And so forth. So natural selection is going to wipe these things out. In order to build a bird from a reptile, you've got to have the end in sight. You've got to be designing these things. And by the way, all scientists today agree that Archaeopteryx is not a reptile, but just a really weird bird. And one of the strange creatures that God's created out there doing that. Now, transitional fossils. I've got 5 minutes here. Charles Darwin said in his book, "The number of immediate varieties which have formerly existed on the earth must be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation in every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graded organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory." He goes on to write and say, yeah, but it's early, we've just started looking for them. We'll find them eventually. Well, 150 years later, we're still looking. We hadn't found them yet. But we found a lot of varieties out there, but none of them match up as any missing links. Now, do you notice any fish today growing little stumps that may become legs? I don't. Do you notice them crawling up on land or whatever? No. Do you see any reptiles developing feathers today? It's not happening. We should be able to see this sort of evidence if it's happening. The problem is it's not happening and never did happen. We don't see half-formed organs. We don't see half-formed eyes. We see complete ones that work. Gould knew about the absence. Stephen Jay Gould, that I quoted earlier, he knew about the absence of these things. But he said Darwin was wrong. He said that punctuated equilibrium was the way it happened. he says that it wasn't this long, slow, gradual change. He said you had this spurt of new life, all these mutations occurring over a short period of time, and because it was such a short period of time, there wasn't enough time to lay down a fossil record, and so therefore that's why we don't see the transitional fossils. He said, he coined the term hopeful monster. Like, over some short period of time, two parents had this monster that was beneficial and able to do things, whatever. And so, interesting theory. What's the primary evidence of his theory? And the reason you're scratching your head is because the primary evidence is the lack of any evidence. Okay, he's saying, because I don't see anything, let me explain it like this. A just so story. So what do we actually find in the record? What's the record actually show us? You've heard of the Cambrian explosion, where they find in this layer, in the geological layers, they find all this vast variety and massive amounts of life and so forth in there. And it just all appears at once in this geologic column right there. And highly complex organs. So the actual record we find is the sudden appearance of highly complex organs, and then it stays the same from there on out. The things we found in that bottom layer we still see today. Okay, so stasis means we see no change after that. So sudden appearance and then no change. What model could be best used to explain that evidence? Yeah, how about special creation? God placed them there, and put them on this earth all at once. Or the flood erased them all at one period of time and laid them all down in that layer. We'll talk more about that in a couple of weeks to come. So, in summary, Darwinian evolution does not explain the production of complex structures, which must have multiple subcomponents in order for it to work. And Darwinian evolution and natural selection actually select out or remove the transitional forms because they're not viable, the non-viability of transitional forms. All right, finally, I love Psalm 139. For you formed my inward parts, you covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret, and skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. You saw my substance, being yet unformed. And in your book they were all written, the days fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them. This is the testimony of God himself, saying, this is why we're here, because he formed us, he made us. Okay, next week we're going to get into the third and final week of our study of the evolutionary versus special creation deal. We're going to try to not demonstrate how life could evolve from a single-celled animal. We're going to try to figure out how to get started with the single-celled animal to begin with, okay? We're going to go for that part of it. And so we'll use some mathematics to try to compute the probability of life originating from nothing. And you'll be amazed by that. Let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you for this evening. Thank you for this church. I pray that you'd bless us now as we go to our homes. Keep us safe as we perhaps might travel some roads tonight or tomorrow that may be a little icy. Bring us back to worship together in this Sunday, Father. I pray that you'd bless our families as well that aren't here. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Hey, sure.
If you agree, you might want to think on it for a little while.
Well, yeah.
But the different sciences reveal a lot of information. Maybe unlock, I don't know. Observe, see a lot of the different designs. Yeah. Just like the computer. My contention is the only person that can be trusted in any of that information